More than 10 years photographing Mars.
It's like driving at 60 miles an hour in your car and trying to image grains of sand on the road. So this is challenging.
The People's Camera, who gets a first look at pictures.
I am a student validator. So what I do, I'm the first person who sees the images coming from the MRO satellite.
Plus hundreds of mini scientists hard at work this summer. This is Arizona Week. Hello and thanks for joining us. This weekend, scientists at the University of Arizona are celebrating more than a decade of photographing Mars. In August of 2005, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter launched into space. It circles Mars every 112 minutes. On board the orbiter, HiRISE, a camera, the high-resolution imaging science experiment. Among the team, more than 25 scientists here at the U of A. Over the last 10 years, the camera has taken more than 50,000 pictures. Images are up to 20,000 by 60,000 pixels. The pictures are processed right here at the University of Arizona. Alfred McEwen is the principal investigator. Here he is describing the red planet.
So what is Mars like? Mars looks very Earth-like. It has sand dunes and mountains and river channels. It looks like desert areas on Earth in the Southwest, Africa, and so forth, very much so. But it's kind of misleading because the environment is actually very different. It's very cold. The atmosphere is much thinner, less than 1% the density of Earth. It's mostly CO2. And it gets cold enough for that CO2 in the atmosphere to actually condense out onto the surface. Dry ice condenses out in the wintertime onto the surface. So it looks very Earth-like, but it's really a pretty alien environment. Eventually, all spacecraft die or stop talking to us or something, run out of fuel, have some sort of a fault. And they will continue to orbit Mars for many decades. There isn't much atmospheric drag, and there are other dead spacecraft orbiting Mars, like the Viking orbiters and Mars Global Surveyor, and they're still there. We're starting to add some space debris around Mars.
More from Dr. McEwen in a moment, but first, it takes about 15 minutes for data to get back to Earth. Then it's downloaded by HiRISE from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California and processed here at the U of A into complete images. They're delivered to a computer system where a U of A student is the first to see what comes back from Mars. Daniel Robinson is a U of A junior majoring in physics and astronomy.
I am a student validator. So what I do, I'm the first person who sees the images coming from the MRO satellite. And essentially, I get the images and I clean them up, make them ready for data evaluation, and essentially try to make them as clean looking as possible.
These images come off HiRISE and get sent directly to you? You're the first person in Tucson who sees them? The first person, period, who sees them?
Yes, essentially, yeah.
That's quite an honor to be the one person who gets to see these images from Mars.
Yeah, I like to think that it's quite the honor. It's really something interesting to be able to be the first person to see these images in all their glory and all the color and all the interesting landscapes, and trying to make them as clean and presentable for the rest of the world.
Do you ever worry that you might miss something?
Well, probably in the beginning, I was a little bit more worried about that. I'm kind of used to seeing the essential problems for whatever the images might come. So no, I guess I really can't say I'm that worried anymore about missing anything.
Do you still get excited? You've been doing this for a year.
Well, yes. Every so often, I will see a picture that you can't help but not marvel in the beauty of it. It's hard sometimes to, working here for a year, I kind of take some of these images for granted. You see the same things over and over again, but yeah, every so often there'll be one that you just have to take a step back and think, wow, that's really something to marvel at.
And it is Mars after all.
It is Mars after all. Everyone likes a good picture of Mars.
How many images do you think that you've seen over the last year?
That's really hard to say. I probably look at 20-ish pictures a day on average.
I'm not a scientist, but I can imagine that when you see these photos, there has to be part of you that still gets excited about what you might see. Do you ever have that feeling?
Yeah, at times. Sometimes for some of the images it'll be something like a cave formation or a possible cave opening. And especially with ones like that, there's always going to be that thought in the back of my mind, well, what would happen if we decided to explore cave systems in Mars? I don't think that's ever actually been done. So it's almost fun to fantasize about what we might find there.
After Daniel studies the photos, the pictures are sent to another set of students who create digital terrain models which are made from 3D images. Nick Porter is a U of A senior majoring in geosciences, a Texas native who came to Tucson hoping to work on HiRISE, and it's been a dream come true.
Yeah, so this is actually a 3D monitor, so I have some glasses if you want to put those on.
Okay.
You can check them out if you want. And so this is a area with some gullies and some nice canyon walls. And so what this is when you overlay them, it kind of changes the perspective of 2 angles to 1 angle, and you kind of see the terrain popping out at you.
Now this is hard for us to show to viewers
Yeah,
at home,
obviously, yeah.
obviously, but you're a geology student, so this is really fascinating to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I take a lot of time, usually look at the images, kind of like pick out cool details like maybe a boulder rolling down a hill or something like that.
So how long does it take you to actually look at one of these projects? Or I mean, is it hours? Is it minutes?
So just to look it over, like the initial images, takes a couple minutes, but to tie it all together and actually work on the images probably takes a couple hours, maybe tens of hours.
Do you ever worry that you may have missed something?
Sometimes, yeah, but I feel like I've, had a good training.
When you're looking at these things, you are looking at imagery that no one else has seen. Very few people are getting access to see. And we're all secretly hoping for life out in outer space, right?
Yeah.
So when you're looking at these things, do you ever think, wait a minute, I just saw something move? Or there's a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, everything you can kind of tell is just either a rock or some dirt. It's not that exciting. When my mind does play tricks on me, it's kind of just like trying to find the boulder in the same place. Because if it's not, then that means it's moved. And like, why did it move? How did it move? Is kind of like what I think about. Maybe it's like, a crab shuffling along or something like that. I guess would be like the weirdest, wackiest thing that I guess I've thought of. But you always find the boulder eventually because you're just in the wrong spot.
Okay, you've seen a rover on Mars.
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard to see the rover because it's probably, like the size of one of these boulders. The coolest thing I think is the tracks, because it'll leave behind these tracks as it's driving along, and you get to see like this path that it takes and kind of like stops, it goes back a little bit, we'll take another path because, I don't know, that's interesting to see like the mind of the rover drivers and how they program it.
What's the coolest thing you have seen?
Probably the strata lines. That's a fancy way of just saying like the rock layers kind of are the same that you would see on Earth. So if you ever go to like the Grand Canyon, you see these like layers upon layers of strata. You see the same thing on Mars in these canyon walls, and that's kind of like what pops out to me the most. Usually they're just straight lines, but sometimes there's faulting that can occur, whether like the surface is stretching or shrinking. So you see these strata that are like offset. There was one project I was working on that had that offset of layers. And it was just really cool because Mars, as we know, it doesn't have active geology of tectonics. And so seeing that as like a past history of that tectonic is really cool. And so what this is you can see how this line traces across the topography, and it becomes offset and kind of continues upwards. So this is actually a fault that runs all the way down. There's more offset and some minor faults right here, kind of offset these bands that are dipping down and to the side. And so these are all part of this huge event that happened, some time ago in Mars' past that kind of offset these layers.
You said earlier that you had seen a rock fall, or you have?
Yeah.
What was that like?
It's really cool. I'm one of the few people who gets excited about them. Basically what it is just you have a crater and you'll have a boulder that, plops down the side of it, and you see those bounce marks. So in one image that's taken maybe a week earlier, you don't see any of the rock fall, and then the next one you'll see these crater marks. And now is these plumes right here. And on the other image you see that right here it's kind of bland and boring, but then the days apart, you have this avalanche that's occurring that's kicking up all this dust. Mostly you can see like a plume here and a plume here.
When you first started this project, I mean, you came to the U of A for this piece.
Yeah, I came to UA for like the undergraduate possibilities of research, and so this is one of the things that I saw that they had and kind of wanted to try and get on.
And when you got hired by HiRISE?
Yeah, it was probably one of the best days of my life, to be honest. Getting that phone call saying like we have an opening and stuff.
To me, I think I can understand why you'd be so excited, but what is it about this experience that has really catapulted your way of thinking?
Probably just the fact that this is important to like the science community and that we're actually doing real data that is used to do science articles and do documentaries on, and it's really exciting to feel like you're a part of that.
Some student scientists have worked on HiRISE since the beginning, more than 10 years ago. Among them, Sarah Sutton. She works on 2 Mars projects, HiRISE and the Cassis camera on the Trace Gas Orbiter of the European Space Agency.
Well, there's so much to see in the HiRISE images, but when I was an undergrad working here, my project was working on the color registrations. We have 3 color bands. So getting them to line up together properly was a task. And so to tell you the truth, I didn't actually look at the images a lot to begin with. I looked at rows and rows and rows of numbers. I just looked at tables and tables of numbers and analyzed them to get the proper algorithm to register the color. So when I actually get to look at the pictures, it's like, wow, this is really beautiful.
Tell me about Mars. What is beautiful about it?
Mars is a very diverse planet, and people think there's nothing happening there because we haven't discovered life. But it's a really active planet, and what HiRISE has discovered is there are a lot of active surface processes, which means things on the surface are changing all the time. There's a lot of dust, which we can understand in Arizona can have a big impact on the weather. So there's frost processes, there's sand dunes that are moving, there's these streaks, these dark streaks that appear in the summer and disappear again in some places. They might be related to liquid water on the surface, which is has huge implications. We see a lot of activity in the polar regions, avalanches. We see dust storms. We see dust devils, just like we have on Earth. So, observing and documenting those changes on Mars has been really exciting. So I think that, and then new impacts, of course, impact processes are from meteorites and meteoroids.
What do we know about Mars geology? I mean, what is the most fascinating thing you've learned?
It's very Earth-like in a lot of ways. There's lava flows, there's volcanism, there's impact craters. We have all these processes on Earth. There's polar, like ice processes, glaciers. And then there's things that we don't have on Earth that's really interesting, that are driven by carbon dioxide ice and carbon dioxide frost. And the weather cycle on Mars involves things that we don't have on Earth, and we don't see analogs for those kinds of processes on Earth, so that's just really fascinating.
As it's been about 10 years now that this research has been going. What are your thoughts on how this will play out in the history books and how you were part of this?
I think about that, and I hope that the work I do contributes to the legacy of Mars exploration. I know that we're paving the way for a lot of new missions. I think we've really raised the bar in terms of what you can do with an orbiting camera. One of my major efforts is in digital terrain modeling, or making topography with the HiRISE images. I think that allows us to do geology on Mars without actually having to go there, or without being able to go there at this point. Those products are also used for analyzing future landing sites of robotic spacecraft, possibly human spacecraft. And they also allow people that aren't scientists, through different visualization techniques, to envision the surface of Mars as if you were there. And I think that's really powerful, and I think that inspires the next generation.
Why are we so impressed by Mars?
I think because we can envision being there. We can see it as a place that humans could go and live. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to that, But I think you can already see in movies and television and books, we can imagine ourselves there. And there's a lot of different ways to imagine that, but I think because it has canyons, it has mountains, it has an atmosphere, although it's too thin to breathe. It has the same length of day, almost as an Earth day. It has the same types of seasons as we have on Earth. So in that way, it seems almost like it could be our next home. But I mean, I think that's why people in general are fascinated with it.
How has, when you look back to the last 10 years, when you started as an undergrad and probably an eventual PhD here, how have you looked at these photographs differently over the years? How's your work changed?
I'm amazed at how I just never tire of seeing these images over, every image is new, even if it's, there's another crater or another gully or canyon. It's like, look at that gully or look at that crater, and you just don't get tired of it. We just can't get enough. So I never get tired of seeing these new images.
And now back to Dr. Alfred McEwen, the lead scientist on HiRISE. When the orbiter reached Martian orbit in 2006, HiRISE began doing everything it was supposed to do. Dr. McEwen, the principal investigator of HiRISE, says it's happily going in circles, and a photo book of Mars marks the occasion.
We recently, about half a year ago, passed 10 years at Mars in the low circular orbit. Also 50,000 orbits and 50,000 images. Those all sort of happened at once. And then we also had this book that we're working on. We didn't really time it for the 10-year anniversary, but it worked out about right for that.
HiRISE is actually orbiting Mars how many times a day?
It's about 12.8 times per day,
Okay.
13, and every day keeps going.
And it's taking thousands of pictures.
We've taken over 50,000 images now over 10 years.
Tell me about the size of this camera, how big it is, how much it weighs, and I mean, you're very proud of this.
So this is a full-scale model of it, which was produced based in Boulder, Colorado, built the camera. And there was a Mars Day in Washington, and the Senate was having, and they wanted to impress them by having a full-scale model, none of these reduced-scale models. But the funny thing was, this was post 9/11, and they had security screen. It was too big to go through the security, so it never actually made it there. But it was very useful as we were building the camera to lay out the thermal control system, wires, the insulation, and so forth. And then we've had it as a display item here and elsewhere since. So it's been fun to have it anyhow.
So for a lot of the folks in Tucson especially, because this research is done here at the U of A, can you explain how exactly this works? The photos are taken, and how quickly do you get them here?
Right, so this is not your ordinary camera. So you can think of it as a big digital camera, but we're driving along, we're flying over the surface at about 3.4 kilometers per second, imaging things about a foot square on the surface. So this is not your normal camera. This is, if you scale it down, it's like driving at 60 miles an hour in your car and trying to image grains of sand on the road. So this is challenging, and what we do is it's called push broom imaging, but just one line at a time. As we move along, we build up the image, except that to get enough signal, we can't just image each little patch of ground once. We have something that digitally images it 128 times and sums up the signal as we go. So it's a very specialized type of camera, and it requires very accurate pointing stability to make this work right. So the way it works is that we design the sequences here. We make the science decisions about what to target, how to set the camera parameters to get the best image. We send that to JPL, that sends it to the spacecraft, it executes it. The data comes down to the Deep Space Network, which goes to JPL. As soon as it arrives there, we pull it here, and we have automated pipelines that then immediately start processing the data into completed images. It comes down, one image is like 28 long, narrow strips. So we put them all together and calibrate it and so forth. And then we have student validators that look at the images to make sure that there isn't any problem with the processing or with the original data, to alert us to issues because we're constantly planning the next images. And we archive the finished data products with the planetary data system and post them on our website, and the science team and the rest of the community starts discovering things.
How much of Mars has this camera managed to photograph?
In 10 years, we have a whopping 2.8% of Mars covered. If it was all unique coverage, When you're imaging little pieces of ground like that, Mars has as much surface area as land area on Earth. It takes a lot of data volume, and that's the limiting factor. But they're very carefully selected targets.
Okay. And what have we seen on Mars?
We have seen lots of things, both ancient bedrock, which is very important for searching for ancient life on Mars and for characterizing landing sites. Also modern Mars, I can say much more about that. We've discovered the current activity that in ways that we didn't know about previously.
A couple years ago, there was the big news that a student here found something on Mars that we weren't expecting or that we hadn't seen before. Tell us about that.
So we had a student who started off as a student image validator and moved up to the independent research project. And he found from looking at a stereo pair some funny things that changed. It wasn't quite, we were looking for gullies that changed. Instead, it was on the opposite side of the crater and there was something else. And I went and looked at that one, that's odd. Something had changed in just a few months. So then we started systematically searching for these and found many more examples. And we found that we call them recurring slope lineae. They are, it's an activity that occurs only on the warmest times and places on Mars, which is different than other activity we'd seen that was mostly the coldest places. And the morphology and the behavior, the seasonal behavior, these form every season. In the warm season, fade away, then reform. And they grow gradually down the slope. So all of this seemed very much like seeping water. And later on, this student, after this initial discovery with HiRISE, went to graduate school, did another study using the spectrometer on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter called CRISM, and discovered that there were hydrated salts associated with these features. So.
You said you've only seen 2.8% of Mars, and that's impressive. But some people might be saying, why so little? What are the challenges?
Yeah, the challenge is the data volume. Now, we've seen all of Mars from other imaging data sets, and there's another camera on MRO that at about 5 meters per pixel has now covered nearly all of Mars. And so we have lots of images of Mars at lower resolution that we can use to zoom in on things of particular interest, and that's what we target with HiRISE.
More than 10 years this camera has been circulating Mars. How is it still possible? I mean, shouldn't there be problems?
There are problems. There are problems with the camera. There are problems with the spacecraft. But both the camera and the spacecraft were built with redundancy and were engineered just to give us options to remotely respond to problems, since we can't go there with a wrench and actually fix it. And so far that's worked. We've found workarounds to all the problems, and we're continuing to function.
So for all intents and purposes, this is doing exactly what it was set out to do.
It is, yeah. Its nominal lifetime was only 4 years at Mars, so it's now exceeded that considerably, but that's good. This camera, yeah, we can look at anywhere on Mars, not just the tiny little areas that the rovers look like. I like to think that we're studying the other 99.99% of Mars.
On the U of A campus, science isn't just an area of study, it's a way of life. And that's especially true in the summertime, when hundreds of kids descend onto campus for Camp Fusion, an opportunity to enjoy science. Here's Noel Hensley from the U of A Flandreau Science Center and Planetarium.
So Fusion Camp is actually a partnership between Flandreau Science Center and the UA bookstores. So what the mission of Fusion is to not only bring kids on campus to explore the university, but our camps themselves are rooted in STEM, and then we infuse literacy, creative arts, and fitness. So that's kind of what sets us apart from other camps.
So what sorts of things can families expect when they send their kids to Fusion?
So not only, like I said, we have our STEM, so it's science, technology, engineering, and math. That's the core of what we do. But we also have things from creative arts, so they'll be doing, creating something from their imaginations. But then going to the rec center or the gym for fitness time. And then we try and have a literacy-rich environment. So you'll see lots of words and papers on the wall, and there's books everywhere. And that's the influence of the UA bookstore that we have present in camp.
You also have scientists from the U of A come into the classrooms.
They do. So even today, there was Dolores Hill from the OSIRIS-REx project. So we try and partner and explore all kinds of programs. There's lots of walking field trips. So we'll go to World of Words, or go see the bug collection, or mirror lab, tree ring lab. So since we have such a rich science environment on the U of A campus, it just partners really well with what it is we're trying to expose kids to.
And how important is it to expose kids to science at this age?
Absolutely so important. I'm a big believer in the sooner we get them inquiry-based. So we don't give them the answers. We want them to inquire. We want them to question. We want them to use their senses. We want them to develop their scientific beings. And they do that at such a young age. We're watching kids play with bugs and digging in the dirt, and all of that is them innately. We just want to make sure that we support them through that.
Have you seen the fruits of your labor come to fruition? Because this has been around for a while.
Yeah, so there's definitely been campers who are either campers and they come back as junior camp counselors. That's our high school program, because they love the science. They love that they get to actually help kids open their eyes to concepts that maybe they wouldn't get in the classroom otherwise. Unfortunately, a lot of classrooms are very rigid and there isn't a lot of time for exploration. So during camp, and especially a STEM-rich camp, there's lots of hands-on, there's lots of inquiry. We want them to spend time with the ideas. So having those other campers come back, they're kind of graduating into our junior camp counselor program. It's so neat to see, because clearly we touched them with science and they come back and they want to do the same.
Was there a real need for this? Did you find that kids weren't interested in the sciences, or how did this idea sort of come?
Well, for one, STEM has been around. It's been a buzzword for a really, really long time. But I feel like as a classroom teacher at one point, science kind of got squished, but outside of like literacy and math. Those were the core areas that we had to focus on as teachers. And I really saw a need for informal science education for one, but just rich science education, period, in the classroom. So programs like this actually, if teachers don't have that time because of mandates for standardized testing and things, that there are programs like this that can help supplement and enrich where that has been lost in the regular classroom.
Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, 4.
And maybe we'll get some scientists out.
And we will get some scientists out of it, guaranteed. Guaranteed.
And that's our program. Before we go, if you'd like to learn more about Mars and HiRISE, the U of A is hosting Science Saturday this weekend. We've posted the information on our website. You'll also find a link to what's known as HiWish, a chance for you to ask HiRISE to take a picture for you. All that information is available on our website, news.azpm.org. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thanks for joining us.